Every year, on the same day, Richard Langston made the same quiet journey. No bodyguards, no fancy cars, no press, just a man and his grief. This year was no different. It had been 3 years since Richard lost his only son, Ethan. The world knew Richard as a billionaire, powerful, serious, untouchable. But none of that mattered today. Today he was just a father visiting his son's grave. Welcome to Chill with Joe. Today's shout-out goes to Christiana, watching from Pretoria. Thank you, Christiana, for being part of this amazing community. To get a shout-out from us, kindly like this video, hit the subscribe button, and tell us where you are watching from in the comment section. Let's unpack the story in full. The cemetery was nearly empty. Grey clouds hung low in the sky. A soft breeze moved through the air, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and old flowers. Richard walked slowly down the narrow path, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't bring anyone with him. He never did. No one else needed to see this side of him, the side that still broke a little more each time he stood in front of that headstone.
He stopped.
There it was, Ethan James Langston, 1999, 2022, beloved son, forever missed. Richard stared at the words carved into stone, words he still couldn't believe were real. He knelt down and gently placed a single white rose on the grave. It was quiet, almost too quiet. He didn't speak, he didn't cry. His face stayed cold, unreadable, just like always. But inside, something was heavy. It had been heavy for a long time. He took a deep breath and looked around, ready to leave, when something caught his eye. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, was standing on the other side of the grave. He wasn't moving, he was just staring at it. In his hand, he held a small old toy car. Richard froze. Who is this boy, he thought. Why is he here? The boy didn't seem to notice Richard, or maybe he did, but he stayed quiet. And that's when everything began to change. Richard stood still, unsure of what he was seeing. A young boy, maybe 10, maybe younger, was standing at Ethan's grave. The boy didn't notice Richard at first. He was too focused on the headstone. He stood quietly, holding something in his hands. As Richard stepped a little closer, he saw what it was. A toy car. Small, old, worn out. One of those little metal ones that boys love to race on the floor. The boy's hands were wrapped tightly around it, like it meant the world to him. He wasn't playing with it, he was just holding it. His lips moved slightly, like he was whispering to someone, or maybe to himself. Richard couldn't hear what he was saying. It was strange. This grave was supposed to be a private place. No one ever came here but him. No one ever remembered his son the way he did. And yet, here was this child, standing quietly, acting like he belonged there. Richard cleared his throat, trying not to sound rude. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was calm but firm. "What are you doing here?" The boy looked up, startled. His eyes were wide and honest. No fear, just surprise. He didn't speak right away. He looked at Richard for a few seconds, then turned his gaze back to the grave. I just came to say hi to Ethan," the boy finally said. The name hit Richard like a wave. This kid had said it so casually, Ethan, like they were old friends. But that didn't make any sense. Richard frowned. "You knew my son?" The boy nodded. "Yes, he used to visit me in the hospital." A long silence followed. The wind blew softly through the trees, and a few leaves danced across the grass. Richard didn't know what to say. His heart skipped a beat. He had no idea Ethan was visiting kids in hospitals. Not once had Ethan mentioned it. "You're sure it was him?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes," the boy said. "He was nice. He used to read me stories. He brought me this car. He held it up. He said it would help me feel strong." Richard stared at the toy. It was scratched and faded, but clearly well-loved. His mind went back to the days when Ethan was young, playing with cars, just like that on the living room floor. It was one of Ethan's favorite things as a child. This moment didn't feel real. "What's your name?" Richard asked quietly. "Sam," the boy replied. Richard looked down at the grave, then back at Sam. There were so many questions running through his mind, but he couldn't ask them all at once. Something about this boy, this small, unexpected visitor, was starting to pull at a place inside Richard he hadn't felt in a long time. A place he thought had died with Ethan. Richard stood there, staring at the boy. The wind had gone still. Everything around them felt frozen, like the world had paused just for this moment. The boy looked nervous now. His fingers tightened around the little toy car, and he took a small step back, unsure of how Richard would react. Richard's voice came out quiet but serious. "You said Ethan used to visit you?" The boy nodded slowly. "Yes, at the children's hospital." Richard's eyes narrowed. "When?" "A while ago," the boy replied, before he died." The word "died" hit Richard hard. Even after 3 years, it still felt like a wound that hadn't healed. But hearing it come from a child made it feel even heavier. The boy looked down at the toy in his hand. "I was really sick. I had to stay in the hospital for a long time. Ethan used to come in with books and toys. He played games with us. He made me laugh even when I felt awful." Richard blinked. He was still trying to make sense of this. Ethan never told him about visiting a hospital. He never mentioned helping kids. Richard thought he knew everything about his son, but clearly he didn't. "He gave me this car," the boy said, holding it up again. "I told him I liked race cars, and he said this one was lucky. He said, 'This car is fast, just like you'll be when you get better.'" There was a long pause. Sam smiled faintly, remembering. "He said if I held onto it, I'd feel brave." Richard stared at the car. It looked like one of Ethan's old toys, the kind he used to carry in his backpack when he was little. He probably donated it without saying anything, just like he did everything else, quietly, kindly, and without asking for thanks. "He was my friend," Sam said softly, looking up at Richard. Those 4 words made something shift deep inside Richard's chest. His throat tightened. For a moment he couldn't speak. Ethan had been so much more than he realized. He wasn't just the smiling boy in the family photos, or the young man who went off to college. He had been someone else's hero, someone's friend, and now that someone was standing right in front of him. Richard finally found his voice, though it cracked slightly. "How long did you know him?" "About 6 months," Sam answered. "He visited almost every week. Then, one day he just stopped coming, and a few days later a nurse told me what happened." Richard looked at the boy, really looked at him, his small frame, the dark circles under his eyes, the quiet strength in his voice. He had suffered too, but he had also been touched by Ethan's kindness in a way Richard never had. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, Richard Langston, the man who always had the right words in business, in interviews, in courtrooms, stood completely speechless. And deep down, something told him this was only the beginning. Richard sat down on the stone edge near the grave. He didn't care that the ground was cold or that his expensive coat might get dirty. Right now, none of that mattered. Sam sat a few steps away, still clutching the toy car. For a while they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy, like it was full of things that needed time to be said. Then Sam started to talk. "He was funny," the boy said. "Not like other grown-ups. He made silly voices when he read books, and he'd make the nurses laugh too. He used to bring cookies and chips from the vending machine when the cafeteria was closed." Richard listened quietly. "He'd show up even on days when he looked tired," Sam went on. "Once I asked him why he came so much. He said, 'Because you guys make my day better.' But really, he made our days better." Richard felt something strange in his chest. Was it pride, guilt, a mix of both? He wasn't sure. But every word Sam spoke made him feel like he was meeting Ethan all over again. Not the boy he raised, but the man Ethan had become without him even knowing. "There was a little girl," Sam continued, "who cried every night because her parents lived far away. Ethan brought her a stuffed bear. She wouldn't sleep without it after that. He gave things to all of us, sometimes toys, sometimes snacks, but he always gave time." Time. That word stung. Richard had spent most of Ethan's life busy with meetings, deals, and deadlines. He gave Ethan money, gifts, a private education, but time, not nearly enough. Sam smiled gently. "Once, when I was feeling really scared about a surgery, Ethan sat with me for hours. He told me about a dream he had, where I was racing cars and winning trophies. He said I was going to beat everything, even the sickness. Richard's eyes burned, but he didn't let the tears fall. He simply nodded. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know he did all of this." Sam looked at him. He didn't do it for people to know, he just wanted to help. Those words hit harder than anything else. Richard had spent his life in the spotlight, building his empire, collecting awards, appearing in magazines. Meanwhile, his son was doing real, quite good in the background. No headlines, no applause, just kindness. That was Ethan's gift. Not money, not power, compassion. Richard looked down at the headstone. For the first time in a long time, he didn't see it as just a marker of death. He saw it as a reminder of the life Ethan had lived. A life full of heart, of giving, of love. "I wish I had known this side of him," Richard said softly. Sam didn't say anything. He just sat with him, a boy who had lost his friend, and a father who had just discovered who his son truly was. And in that quiet moment, Ethan's spirit felt more alive than ever. Richard couldn't just walk away. Not now. After sitting in silence with Sam a little longer, he stood up and asked gently, "Where are your parents?" Sam pointed toward the parking lot. "My mom's in the car. She waits while I visit Ethan. She always lets me come alone." Richard hesitated for a moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in years, something simple, human, and kind. "Would you both join me for lunch?" he asked. Sam looked surprised but nodded. A few minutes later, Richard was driving them to a quiet restaurant nearby. It was small, nothing fancy, not the type of place a billionaire usually went. But today, Richard didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a man who was trying to know his son, even after he was gone. Sam's mother, Angela, was soft-spoken and polite. She thanked Richard for the meal, but said he didn't have to do anything for them. He simply replied, "I want to know more about Ethan." Her eyes softened. "He was special," she said. Over lunch, Angela shared stories that made Richard's heart swell with both pain and pride. "He started coming to the hospital about a year before the accident," she said. "At first it was just books. He'd read to the children in the cancer ward. Then it became snacks, toys, little surprises. He never made a big deal about it. He never even told us his last name." Richard raised his eyebrows. "You didn't know he was my son?" Angela shook her head. "No, not until after the news came out about his passing. One of the nurses recognized his photo. We were all shocked. None of us knew he came from money." Richard leaned back, stunned. Ethan had kept it all secret. His name, his wealth, his family. He had wanted nothing in return for his kindness. Angela continued, her voice soft. "During one of Sam's harder treatments, the hospital said insurance wouldn't cover everything. A few days later, the bill was paid. We asked who did it, but they said it was anonymous." She smiled faintly. "Now I know it was him." Richard couldn't speak. His chest felt tight. He'd spent years writing checks to big causes, donating for tax breaks, putting his name on buildings. But his son, he had helped quietly, privately, without expecting praise or reward. Sam was eating quietly beside his mother, still holding the toy car in one hand. Richard looked at him, then back at Angela. "Why did he do it?" he asked, almost to himself. Angela gave a small, sad smile. "Because he cared. He saw pain and didn't look away. That's just who he was." Those words stayed with Richard long after the plates were cleared. He looked out the window of the little restaurant and realized something important. He had spent his life building towers and companies. But Ethan had built something even greater. He had built hope. A few days later, Richard found himself standing in front of a building he had never paid much attention to. St. Grace Children's Hospital. It was bright and cheerful on the outside, with cartoon drawings on the windows and balloons tied to the railings. But inside, he knew, were children fighting some of the hardest battles of their lives. He stepped through the doors, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. For a man like Richard, who was used to boardrooms, luxury offices, and high-rise towers, this place felt completely different. There were no suits. No money talks, just soft voices, medical charts, and tiny beds surrounded by stuffed animals. He introduced himself at the front desk. The moment he said, "I'm Ethan Langston's father," the nurse's eyes filled with tears. "You're Ethan's dad?" she asked in disbelief. "Oh, we loved him. Within minutes, several staff members came forward. Nurses, volunteers, even a janitor who remembered Ethan by name. They led Richard to a small room near the children's wing and began to tell him stories. One nurse, Maria, held up a photo of Ethan sitting on the floor with 3 children around him, reading a picture book with wild hand motions and a silly grin. "He was magic," she said, wiping her eyes. "He had this way of making the sickest kids forget they were even in a hospital." Another staff member shared a video on her phone. In it, Ethan was dancing like a goofball with a little girl who had no hair. She was laughing so hard she nearly fell over. "We'd have bad days," one nurse said, and then Ethan would show up with his bag of snacks and comic books. Suddenly, everything felt lighter. Richard sat in silence, listening, watching. One doctor stepped forward and shared a memory that struck him deeply. There was a boy who stopped speaking after a traumatic surgery. No one could reach him. Ethan started visiting him every week, just sitting with him, playing quiet games. After a month, the boy whispered his first word, "Ethan." Richard looked down at his hands. These weren't just stories. They were proof that his son had left behind something far greater than wealth. Something real, something lasting. One of the nurses handed him a folder. "These are pictures we collected after he passed. We planned to send them to his family, but we didn't know who to contact." Richard opened it slowly. Photo after photo of Ethan, smiling, reading, hugging children, laughing beside hospital beds. In each picture, his son looked truly alive. More alive than he ever looked in board meetings or at fancy family events. Richard's chest ached. How had he not known? How had he missed this side of his son? And then, something inside him began to shift, just a little. For years, he had locked his heart away, frozen by grief and guilt. But now, sitting in a children's hospital, surrounded by stories of love and kindness, his heart started to thaw. Tears filled his eyes, and this time he didn't hold them back. "I'm proud of him," he whispered, "so proud." And for the first time since Ethan's death, those words didn't feel painful. They felt healing. Richard Langston had spent most of his life building things, companies, empires, a name the world respected. But for the first time in years, he didn't want to build for profit. He wanted to build something that mattered, something his son would be proud of. Only weeks after visiting the children's hospital, Richard called a press conference, the first he'd done since Ethan's passing. Cameras flashed. Reporters filled the room, expecting some big business announcement. But Richard surprised them all. "I'm not here to talk about money," he said. "I'm here to talk about my son." He took a deep breath, holding back emotion. Ethan was the kindest person I've ever known. He spent the last year of his life helping children in hospitals, quietly, without anyone knowing. And now, it's my turn to continue what he started. That day, Richard announced the creation of the Ethan Langston Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping sick children across the country. The foundation would cover medical bills, fund life-saving treatments, deliver books and toys to hospitals, and provide emotional support for families in need. But this wasn't just about writing checks. Richard got involved, truly involved. He visited hospitals, met with doctors, and sat on the floors with children just like Ethan once did. He handed out toys. He read bedtime stories. He listened. At first, people were shocked. The cold, distant billionaire they once knew was now seen kneeling beside hospital beds, laughing with children and hugging tearful parents. His staff didn't know what to make of it. His business partners were confused. The media called it a rebrand, but it wasn't. It was real. Richard wasn't doing this for the cameras or the headlines. He was doing it because it made him feel closer to his son. One afternoon, after delivering a box of books to a children's cancer center, a little girl tugged on his sleeve and asked, "Are you Ethan's dad?" Richard knelt down and smiled. "Yes," he said softly, "I am." The girl hugged him tightly and whispered, "He was my hero." And in that moment, Richard realized something powerful. His son was gone, but his love was still changing lives. And now, through the foundation, it would keep doing so, and for years to come. The more time Richard spent helping children through the foundation, the more he found himself thinking about Sam, the boy who stood at Ethan's grave. The boy who held tightly to a small toy car. The boy who reminded him of Ethan in the most unexpected ways. At first, Richard visited Sam just to check in, bringing books, small gifts, sometimes sitting with him during treatments. But as weeks passed, the visits became more regular. They talked more, laughed more, grew closer. Sam began to look forward to Richard's visits. He'd wait by the window with that same toy car in his hand, his eyes lighting up the moment Richard walked in. "Guess what I learned today?" Sam would say, launching into stories about school, space facts, or his favorite superheroes. And Richard listened, not just out of politeness, but with real interest. He asked questions, gave advice, even helped with homework sometimes, though Sam was much better at math than he was. One afternoon, after a long day of hospital tests, Sam looked up at Richard and asked, "Can I call you Mr. Richard? Or is it okay if I just say Grandpa?" The question caught Richard completely off guard. He smiled, a real one, soft and full of warmth. "Grandpa sounds perfect," he replied, his voice a little shaky. From that moment on, something inside Richard shifted. He no longer felt like a visitor in Sam's life. He felt like family. And Sam, he filled a space in Richard's heart that had been empty since the day Ethan died. It wasn't about replacing his son. No one could ever do that. But love doesn't replace, it expands. Richard began attending Sam's school plays and science fairs. He even helped surprise Sam with a bike when his treatments were finally over for the season. The joy on the boy's face was priceless. Angela, Sam's mom, often watched from a distance, smiling with quiet gratitude. She knew what Richard had lost and what he was slowly finding again. Through their bond, Richard began to heal, not by forgetting Ethan, but by living the way Ethan had, with love, with time, with heart. And every time Sam ran into his arms or called to say hello, Richard was reminded. Sometimes family finds you in the most unexpected places. 1 year had passed. A year since Richard met Sam. A year since he discovered the truth about Ethan's quiet kindness. A year since his heart began to heal. And now Sam was in remission. The doctors called it a miracle. His body had responded well to the treatment, some of it funded by the very foundation Ethan had inspired. The boy, who once stood so small and quiet at the grave, was now full of energy, laughter, and life. To celebrate everything the foundation had done, and to honor Ethan's memory, Richard planned something special, a charity gala. It was held at a beautiful hall, filled with families, doctors, supporters, and children who had been touched by Ethan's legacy. Some of the kids who were once in hospital beds now ran around the room, dressed in tiny suits and colorful dresses. Photos of Ethan lined the walls, reading to children, smiling, sitting cross-legged on hospital floors. At the center of it all stood Richard, wearing a simple black suit. No flashy tie, no fancy watch, just a small pin on his jacket. A silver race car, just like the one Ethan had once given Sam. As the evening went on, guests shared stories, laughed, cried, and made donations to continue the work Ethan had started. The foundation had now helped dozens of children, paying for treatments, surgeries, therapies, and support services for families in need. Finally, Richard stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent. He looked out at the crowd, then down at Sam, who was sitting in the front row beside his mother, beaming with pride. Richard took a breath. 1 year ago, he began, I stood at my son's grave, believing I had lost everything. I didn't know then that his spirit had already planted seeds, in the hospital, in the hearts of children, in the life of a little boy named Sam. He paused, his voice trembling. I thought I knew my son, but I was wrong. Ethan was more than I ever imagined. He was kind, generous, and brave. He didn't need cameras or applause. He just wanted to help. Richard's hands shook slightly as he continued. I've made a lot of money in my life, built many things, but nothing I've ever done compares to what this foundation, his foundation, has become. And then, for the first time in public, Richard Langston cried. But these weren't tears of grief. They were tears of pride, tears of love, tears of a father who had finally found peace in his son's legacy. The crowd stood and applauded, not for the billionaire on stage, but for the boy who had changed lives with nothing more than time, heart, and a little toy car. In that moment, Richard knew. Ethan wasn't gone. He was everywhere. The sky was clear this time. No clouds, no cold wind, just sunshine and soft birdsong in the distance. Richard walked slowly through the cemetery, not alone like before. Beside him was Sam, holding a small white flower in his hand. It had been exactly 1 year since that first unexpected meeting, the day Richard's life began to change. And now everything felt different. They reached the grave. Ethan James Langston, 1999, 2022, beloved son, forever missed. The stone hadn't changed, but the man standing in front of it had. Richard looked down at the name, his heart full, not broken. Behind him, the world he had built for Ethan's memory was alive and growing, a foundation dozens of children helped, and a boy who now felt like family. Sam stepped forward and gently placed the flower at the base of the grave. He looked at the name, smiled and whispered, "Thank you, Ethan." Richard knelt down beside him, his knees resting on the soft grass. He didn't wipe the tears that filled his eyes. He let them fall freely. "You've changed the world, son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And you've changed me." There was no wind, no sound, just stillness and peace. For the first time since Ethan's death, Richard didn't feel like he was saying goodbye. He felt like he was saying thank you. He stood up, rested a hand on Sam's shoulder, and together they walked away, not with grief, but with hope. The cold, distant billionaire the world once knew was gone. In his place was a man who had finally found what mattered most: love, legacy, and the quiet, powerful gift of a son's heart. Sometimes the people who leave us too soon still find ways to leave footprints behind, not in sand, but in hearts. Ethan Langston didn't live a long life, but in the time he had, he touched more lives than most people ever will. Through kindness, through compassion, through the simple act of showing up when it mattered most. And Richard Langston, a man once trapped by grief and guilt, discovered something far more valuable than wealth: the power of love and the healing that comes from giving. Sam may have lost a friend, Richard may have lost a son, but in each other they found something neither expected, a reason to keep going. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Be someone's Ethan. Show up, be kind, help where you can. You don't need $1 billion to change someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is your time, your love, or even a small toy car. If you believe more stories like this need to be shared, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story. And if you know someone who needs hope, share this video with them. Let Ethan's legacy live on through all of us.